Okay. Go, Harriet.
Well, welcome everybody to another Earth Exchange Cafe, and we are delighted to have Chris Jordan with us to converse with us, to share thoughts and stories for the next hour. So let's all close our eyes and imagine that we're in a cafe together. We've opened the door and stepped through into our favorite cafe that by now, after 18 months of these conversations, is now full of books and articles and music and art, tapestries and residues of beautiful conversations that are just there waiting to be picked up again. And so we are surrounded by compatriots and colleagues, friends, and people who have been on this journey with us. And we settle on down into our favorite chairs with our tea, our hot chocolate, whatever it is that we want to hold and cradle for the next hour. And first of all, we welcome in the directions. We welcome in the east. We welcome in the hawk who soars above our heads in the air, who gives us clarity, inspiration, and the newness of the first days, the first moment of the day. And then we move to the south. We feel the fire of the midsummer and the great stag with his power and his creativity. And we welcome him and his energy. And to the west, we see the salmon of wisdom as the sun sets across the great ocean of water. And we feel the power and the wisdom of our ancestors, of bloodline, as well as those whose work has gone before us, whose work it is we are carrying on. And to the north, we bow to the great bear in the starry sky and also in her den, sleeping through the darkness, reminding us that rest, recuperation is really part of this experience from just being in a quiet place, in a quiet space. And from there, we can then move towards being reborn in the morning light. And so we welcome in everybody into the circle. We welcome Trebi and Chris Jordan. It's absolutely wonderful to have you here, and I shall pass over to Trebi.
Thank you, Harriet. Yes, it is indeed wonderful to have Chris Jordan here with us today for Earth Exchange Cafe. I have been familiar with his work for many years, and it's truly remarkable work. And he's going to be showing us some images of his work. Chris is a photographer and also a writer. He is very well known for photographs that he took of baby albatrosses who have died by ingesting so much plastic that was in the food that their parents fed to them. And he's going to show photos of that. He also made a film called Albatross about his work, really a beautiful, beautiful film. And he's the author of 4 books that contain his photography and many different projects. And he is a very deep thinker and feeler. He has a deep feeler as well as a profoundly gifted artist. So Chris, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you, Trevi, and greetings, Harriet. It's so good to be with you both.
So I know, as your Facebook friend, I believe you're in Chile now. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm in the very southern tip of South America in one of the world's southernmost towns, just looking out across the Straits of Magellan right out my window here.
Yeah. And so briefly, what are you doing there? What brought you there?
Well, I was in Chile working on a project in the very northern part of Chile in the high desert. And I got stuck here during the pandemic and have just slowly been moving further and further south. ever since I've been here. And now I'm in a new love relationship. And she's from here. So she convinced me to come down, and I'm kind of falling in love with Punta Arenas.
Oh, wow, that's great. Falling in love with a person and falling in love with a place.
It's a pretty wild place. And it's the last place I ever imagined I would end up settling, but it really feels like being on another planet here. Like the sky is just so bright and vivid, and the winds are so fierce. Is absolutely whistling outside my window right now. It's kind of the equivalent of being somewhere in northern Alaska, a really
Oh.
wild, kind of vibrating place.
Well, yeah, we can hear the wind now and then. So, and I want to talk later about some of the beautiful images that you've been posting from being there. But let's start with the albatrosses. You might want to show us a photograph or two of them as and tell us how did you get involved in this work with these little birds? Which is so beautiful and so sad, this work. It's like these
Mm.
are images that we don't want to see, and yet once you see them, you can't forget them, and you can't forget them, and you don't want to forget them. I think that's important too.
Ah, well, it's a project that that began with the notion of witnessing. And I learned many years ago that this was back in 2008 when the issue of plastic in the ocean first came into public consciousness. And I was looking for a way to depict this kind of global phenomenon. And I learned that there's an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that is covered with the bodies of tens of thousands of dead birds who are filled with plastic. And immediately I felt this powerful magnetic pull to go to this place and experience it in person. And there were already hundreds of photographs of them up on the internet. Before I went to Midway, before I took these photographs, if you searched on the internet for birds filled with plastic on Midway Island, a whole set of photographs appeared. And so when I went there, I didn't know how I was going to do anything differently, how I was going to, I don't know, transform or contribute to what was already there. But I knew I had to see it in person because I wanted to feel it myself.
Hmm.
And so these are unaltered photographs. I didn't manipulate the plastic at the time I took the photographs or later in Photoshop. These are straight documentary photographs of the actual stomach contents of baby birds on one of the remotest islands on Earth.
So how did you resolve that question about how am I going to do it differently?
Well, one thing I learned from one of my earlier projects when I went down to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, the reason that I went there was because what I was seeing coming out of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, all the journalism, I didn't see any photographs that had been made with reverence.
Mhm.
And this to me is one of the most important things about photography. It's like an incredibly powerful channel in photography is every photograph, it shows you the subject. Like you can look at a photograph and see the thing, but it also shows you the relationship between the photographer and that subject. And in the journalism that was coming out of Hurricane Katrina, I was seeing the kind of standard, really, what's the word? Just a superficial look at this tragedy in a way that was emotionally exploitive. And that's why I went, is I wanted to go and feel it more deeply and do work that felt more reverent.
Huh.
And I learned something in that process about the power of photography to convey that sense of reverence. And I think that was one of my motivations to go to Midway Island, is to go in that kind of space and not only capture photographs, but create a kind of altar and make a prayer for those beings.
And it shows. I mean, it really shows in those photographs that there, I mean, there's a beauty in all of that awfulness. And I would that and something I know have noticed in your film Albatross is that there's at least one sequence where I think you've witnessed a little bird dying, and you put your hand on its body just as it's taken its last breath. You put your hand on its body. No narrative. So it's not, you're not trying to be the impartial journalist here. You are bringing your reverence into what you're creating.
That was such an important part of that project for me. And it was so interesting because um, as I went back to Midway over and over again and went deeper and deeper into this project, all that time I was looking at the medium of documentary films and thinking, like, how can I escape the formula, the kind of factual formula where people present charts and graphs and do interviews and are trying to convey facts? Because the experience of being on Midway Island for me was, it was transformative. It was a spiritual experience. And it was permeated with layers and layers of poetry and lyricism. And that was the transformative part. It wasn't just the fact that there were birds with plastic in them. It was the experience of confronting death so directly, and the poetry of this incredibly remote place, and the fact that of all the possible birds it could be delivering this profound message to humanity, it's the albatross, a creature with 1,000-year history in our poetry and our literature as a carrier of messages. And that's what I wanted to convey through my film. And so I tried to construct it like kind of like a work of literature rather than a more of a factual documentary film.
Yeah, and you do show images of the beauty of the birds, you know, of like with their wings and how they flap their wings, and it's really beautiful, and it timed with the soundtrack as well. So before we went live for today, and you and Harriet and I were talking a little bit about grief, and you were talking about the importance of actually feeling grief and not rushing into trying to create a solution. Could you elaborate on that?
Oh, well, that really became the heart of that project for me. And it was a life-changing experience to fully connect with grief and to understand what is the true nature of grief. Because up until that time, I had always thought for my whole life that grief is a bad experience. That it's like grief is in the same category as despair and sorrow and sadness, and all of those are bad feelings to be avoided. Or if you feel them, then they're to be gotten over and get back to try to be happy all the time. And I had the astonishing experience on that island that every time I was with a bird that died, which was hundreds of times, I just had a flood of tears. And it happened so many times that I began to have a perspective on the experience. It's like I began to draw back and have a perspective on my experience of it. And I started wondering, why do I feel so much? Why am I crying so much for these birds that I never thought of in my whole life up until they came here? And it's just one bird that died, but I felt it as if it was a member of my own family. And why is that happening? And I remember there's one time, it was a bird that that I was filming, it's in the film. It's the bird that was on the seawall. And even 10 years later, I feel it again, is it just hit me like a thunderbolt as that bird let go of its life. And the tears came again. I realized the reason that I felt so much is because I love them. And that's what grief is. It's not some kind of horrible feeling or a bad feeling. It's the same thing as love. Grief is the love that we feel for other beings who are suffering, or for something that we're losing that we love. And it's such a liberating experience to understand grief as being the same thing as love, because then we're free to feel it. We can fully feel it. And in that experience, then when we were pushing grief over here, thinking it's bad and trying to avoid it, well, our love is over there as well. And so there's this paradox in accepting grief, which is like when we bring in our pain for the world and allow ourselves to fully feel it, a doorway opens that brings us home, that carries us home to the love that we are made of. And in that place, we're whole and we have access to our wisdom and compassion. And so I believe grief is an absolutely transformative experience. And it's something that I wish could be healed in our culture, is our collective relationship with grief.
Yeah, there was somebody just told me a couple of weeks ago that there's a new ruling, or whatever you might call it, from the diagnostic manual that doctors use, that if you suffer from grief for more than a year, it's considered a mental illness. So I mean, it's ridiculous. There's no timeline. And when you open up to that grief, that is where the beauty comes in. And that's what we find over and over with Radical Joy for Hard Times, when people go to these wounded places and they share their stories and they find beauty, and then they make beauty. And over and over, people say, I fell in love with this place because grief. And when you open up the grief, you feel the dynamism of the love that comes with it.
Yes, it's like there's this triangular relationship between grief, love, and beauty.
Yeah.
And
you got
whenever you encounter one of them, you immediately, the other ones arrive. It's like three sisters who are always dancing around each other.
Grief, love, and beauty. Yes. So I'm curious as to what you were like as a little kid. Did you who were you then that made you who you are now with this kind of sensibility?
Oh, well, it's so strange, isn't it? To the age that I'm at, I guess it's the same for everyone who gets older. I look at myself in the mirror and I see an aging man, but I still feel like I'm exactly the same as I was when I was 7 years old. I'm like a little 7-year-old riding around in an aging machine. But I think I've always been kind of joyful. And when I was a kid, we lived directly across the street from a forest, a really beautiful, fairly good-sized forest, and I spent all my time over there. My parents put me in school when too young. I was the youngest person in my kindergarten class by almost a year. And I was also a very slow developer. And so I looked a year younger than that. So, and that's stayed that way all the way through my entire schooling. I was always the kind of youngest, physically smallest, and most immature kid in my class. And so I got bullied a lot. And my thing was to just escape on my own. And I had a bunch of different tree forts, and I would climb trees and sit for hours and enjoy birds. And I never felt lonely. It never really bothered me that I was kind of living a more solitary life.
So was there like a what was it that made you start to see the world as a possible photograph, or aspects of it?
Both of my parents were artists. My mom was a watercolor painter, and I always loved to she didn't teach me how to paint. I wasn't really interested in painting, but I loved watching her paint. And my dad was a photographer, and he did a different kind of photography, but he was a very serious amateur and and partially professional photographer. And he carried his camera everywhere and was always showing me what it looked like through the viewfinder. He would set it up on a tripod and show me what it looked like. And so I had these two visual influences of kind of visually capturing the world from a pretty young age. And my dad, he bought me cameras from a pretty young age too. I had like 7 or 8 cameras over time, and I think so. It just became kind of a natural thing. I sort of always knew I was going to grow up and be a photographer.
Oh, yeah. Well, before we move on, Harriet, you had a very interesting question when we were talking before we started. I wonder, this seems like it might be a good time for you to pose that to Chris.
Yeah, and just going back to what you're saying about forts in the forest. Next month, we're talking to Eva Sims, who has worked a lot on children's forts in sort of scrubby lands, bits that are forgotten at the edge of towns, and what that means when we sort of recolonize those forgotten bits of broken, wounded landscapes in the towns. So perhaps you're more than welcome to listen in, because it might be quite interesting. But going back to the question of and the three sisters, the going into love through grief, or when we find that we are grieving, love and beauty turn up. And I'm interested in where bearing witness sits with that, and how you mentioned being emotionally exploitative, and all those sort of things that we try and avoid, and how real photography or real presence, real bearing witness can potentially be that opening into grief. So I just wonder whether you can tell us a little bit more about that. Because bearing witness is such an important part of Radical Joy for Hard Times. It's not about fixing, it's not about blame, it's not about saying, because of what you did, X, Y, and Z has happened, and now an albatross is dead. So yeah, just tell us a little bit more about what bearing witness feels like in your work.
Oh, such an important question. My Midway project was, in a very large way, was about bearing witness. And in that way, it was deeply inspired and influenced by the work of my dear friend and our national treasure, the writer Terry Tempest Williams. And I read her book Refuge back when I was in high school, and that was a book about bearing witness of the death of her mother at the same time as the death of an ecosystem that she lived near. And she made so many powerful statements in that book about the heart of what it means to bear witness. And for me, what that experience is, it's when we're in the presence of another being who is suffering and we're helpless to do anything about it, then all there is left to do is to not turn away, is to be there with that being. And there's something transformative that happens, I think, for both parties. And it's the sheer helplessness of not being able to do anything about their suffering that is so powerful, because it makes us feel empathy. It's like those two beings are the same being for that moment. The suffering is equally shared and equally held. And it's such a powerful doorway into compassion. And it's something that's so easy to kind of skip over. And this is to me, it's a broken part of the paradigm of environmentalism right now, is that the conversation about environmentalism, Trebi, you gave this kind of hilarious three-part thing that you said in your book. What was it again?
Scare, blame, rally. It's the environmental movement's formula
Oh,
for how to write about things. Scare,
ugh.
blame, rally.
Terrify everybody with the bad news, blame them, and then immediately start talking about solutions. And that is all taking place in a very superficial way. And I think a part of why that conversation exists, and it's just so ubiquitous everywhere, is that it it gives us a way to avoid feeling anything. And that's what happens when we bear witness. We feel something, and we feel something profound that can literally crumble our worldview and infuse itself into the marrow of our bones. And the feeling that tends to happen in that space of bearing witness is it's grief.
Mhm.
And in grief, then we're crushed, but in the best possible way. It breaks our heart, but it breaks it open. And in that place, then we come away from the experience of witnessing as changed forever.
It's like admitting helplessness, allowing powerlessness.
Can I ask, do you have a story to tell about how you went through that process? Because I would imagine that the very first time you went to the island and you saw these dead beings with the plastic, you must have perhaps gone through the microcosm of how can this have happened? Who's to blame? What can I do about this? And could you just maybe tell us and elaborate on that story of how you came to bear witness in the truest, most sort of compassionate way that you have?
Well, it's fascinating to look back on it. I went to the island a total of 8 times over 4 years. And it's interesting to see the footage from our first trip, because I went with a little team, and basically the idea was to film me photographing and do YouTube videos and to make some kind of documentary that just proved that I wasn't putting the plastic in the birds myself. It was a kind of forensic team almost. And those early videos are very kind of plastic activism oriented. And there was also just a kind of overpowering feeling of horror in that first trip. And in the second trip, the second time I went, we saw live birds on the island, but there were many that were dying. We're exactly at the moment when they were most dying. And so the arc of it for me started in horror, and I came back from the first trip in a state of depression. I was absolutely devastated by what I had seen, and I published that work and received thousands of emails from around the world of people who expressed that those photographs made them feel hopeless and panicked. And that's how I felt about it. And it was with Terry Tempest Williams' guidance and with the guidance of my chair's teacher, Joanna Macy, that I was able to return to the island and just go deeper. And there was a slow arc that happened over years that went from horror and moved from horror into fear. And then from fear, it moved into curiosity. And from curiosity, then I started just falling in love with the birds. Like I first went for the plastic. I was interested in plastic, and all of my photographs were of plastic, and almost no photographs of the live birds. And slowly it was like this. It dawned on me. I never had the thought until after it was all done. It just dawned on me how amazing these birds are. And slowly the plastic became less relevant I was less and less interested in the plastic and more interested in just these incredibly beautiful, magnificent, graceful beings. And I began to see over time how dark my vision had been earlier. Like I went with this horrible, exactly, what was it, Trebi? Shame,
Scare, blame, rally.
scare and blame. I was permeated with those two feelings myself the first time I went to Midway. And it felt like this perspective just slowly opened for me. And I realized that was kind of the midway point of the project for me. The island became the name of the island became such a powerful metaphor. Is I had been focusing all of this time on the bad news. And this, I think it's the error of the whole environmental movement, or much of the environmental movement, is we're focused only on the bad news and amplifying the bad news and trying to terrify everybody more and more, because like that's the main part of the story. And I slowly began to see a bigger picture. And it is that we still have to hold the bad news. We have to face it and feel everything that we feel, because otherwise we're living in denial. It's just that the bad news isn't the whole story. There's this other side. And or you could, in another way, it isn't even two things in balance. It's like the bad news is this small thing, and inside the bad news is held inside an envelope of the incredible beauty and magic and mystery and miracle of the living world. And it just slowly in waves crashed over me more and more and more until I finally just got it. And that's the emotional arc that I tried to build into Albatross.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And thank you for telling that story. Yeah, I'd like to switch up now and show you some of your recent work, like some of these amazing photographs that you sent from Chile. They're so different. They're so different from the little birds, and they're so different from an earlier work, which we're going to talk about next, which is running the numbers. It's like they're just absolute polarities of one another. So would you show us one of these beautiful photographs and tell us about what kind of mindset you are entering, that this is what's calling to you now? Yeah. These focal points in the midst of the vastness of water and sky, gray blue tones. So bring us deep into that, if you would, Chris.
Oh, well, first of all, thank you for your interest in this new work. It's a profoundly uncomfortable project to be doing because it's so different than anything I've ever done. And I'm having to work really hard to overcome my own internal judgments about the irrelevance of turning toward beauty. It's really weird. It's like I feel like I don't know where I got this idea, but for the longest time I had the idea that if you turn fully toward beauty and just experience beauty, then you're doing something bad. Like you have to be, I was the guy for so many years who someone would say, wow, look how beautiful. And I would be like, yeah, but they're on their way to extinction. And like, you always have to turn toward the bad news and amplify the bad news. And this work is not about doing that. It's about just being in a place of beauty. And so what I'm doing here, this is the Straits of Magellan, just literally 1 block from where I live. And this is a 1 hour exposure
of
a storm.
Wow.
And so the Straits of Magellan here, this part of the world is the jet stream is at ground level. And so we get the most unbelievably powerful winds. And usually it's further to the south, but it does these wobbling things where for a while we'll have winds that are like 60 to 100 miles an hour for days at a time. and the water is whipped to an absolute froth, and these amazing multi levels of lenticular clouds are just zooming by. And so I open my lens for a long time, and all of the movement of the water, all of the crashing waves and the whipping froth and the movement of the sky over a long period is all captured in a single frame. And there's a really interesting thing that happens in that process, is that there's a kind of stillness that is revealed inside the movement. And I'm absolutely fascinated by this, because it's the same, it's like the visual representation of what happens in meditation. It's like we're aiming for a kind of quieting, and these photographs sort of show a little bit of what that experience is like. And so I'm always pushing, like this one this one has a bell, like something to ground the mind, and this one is without a bell. And this is an even longer exposure, and I know they're uncomfortable to look at in a way, like they really push the limits of abstraction. But there's this, at least what I love about them is not only the incredibly complex long tonal scale that is created by this process, but the sense of stillness, this kind of silence.
Yeah. I know they are so quiet, they are very quiet photographs. And I think they're very compelling anyway, but when you know that they were, I don't like the word captured, but they arose out of this utter wildness and frenzy and tempest and movement. It's just extraordinary. I mean, that's just something to just not stop thinking about. What does this tell us about about our lives and our thoughts?
To me, it must be how a long living being must see our lives, like a tree. If you were an 800-year-old oak, we would look this still and just this kind of beauty. You'd think maybe it was the other way around, that we would just zoom past really fast and so frenetic, but perhaps we're just so still and so stretched out. It's beautiful, really beautiful.
Yeah, that's a great image, Harriet.
Well, there's such a strange juxtaposition between the experience of taking these photographs and then what the photograph looks like at the end. Because imagine being out, there are some places where I can stand in the protection of there's some wind blocks, but they don't always work. And sometimes I have to just stand with my jacket protecting the camera from moving. But imagine just being in this absolutely fierce wind and frequently cold. And during the exposure, it frequently happens that a shower will come by. And so I'm like standing with my jacket protecting the camera, or an umbrella, and just like, rah, an incredible cold, and my hands are getting numb from the cold, and I'm slowly starting to feel the warmth leaving my body, and just like this buffeting, powerful, bracing experience. And I come back, and this is the photograph. That's the feeling of these photographs is, to me, it's exactly the feeling of dropping into meditation. That has nothing to do with what my experience was out there on the shore.
So when you first saw one of these photographs, were you surprised to see how still it was, or were you expecting it?
Well, there's a long history in photography of a lot of really amazing photographers who've used a very similar technique. And there's a photographer named Michael Kenna who has worked with this kind of technique for many, many years, and his work is absolutely brilliant. And for me, the biggest inspiration is a Japanese photographer named Hiroshi Sugimoto. And really, this whole project is inspired by one photograph that he took from looking out over the sea from a cliff that was a long exposure. And that photograph, it's it's just so Japanese and so deeply rooted in stillness. And so so that's another kind of thing that I'm battling with is this is very traditional photography, and I have all of these internal judgments about that. But I'm working on a technique. I've developed a technique that is borrowed from astrophotography,
Hmm.
which this is all digital and extremely high resolution. And these images are stitched from many different frames, and then I layer many exposures together. So like the image you're looking at right now might have been created from maybe 64 or 72 frames of the
Okay.
same scene. And in that process, the tonal range just gets smoother and smoother and smoother. And that feeling of silence it becomes more powerful. And so I've been beginning to print these images, and they're just a knockout when they come out on paper.
Yeah, I'll bet. So now well, we have a look at this one first.
I find myself circling back to birds.
Yes, you do.
There's this small population of cormorants here, and cormorants are totally adorable. Cormorants are like halfway between penguins and seagulls. They fly underwater, and they walk in that sort of very awkward, hilarious looking way when they're on land, the way penguins walk. And they're afraid to come to land, and so they only live on these structures out offshore a little bit. And this
Oh, is that what that is?
that's an abandoned pier that's actually visible from my window right here. And that is the entire population of cormorants in this part of the world. And they nest right there. And I took that photograph from my window during the most unbelievably gnarly storm. The wind must have been 100 miles an hour, and they're all hunkered down on their nest with their babies as these sheets of water come whipping across. It's an astonishing thing to see. And it feels like a metaphor, like that's all of us. It's like in the storm of these times, just hunkered down, going like, what is going on?
Well, I want to, we have about 10, 15 minutes left. So, but I do want to quickly show, because it's such an amazing contrast, one of your images from Running the Numbers. So you made a book, and you had a series of photographs in which you depicted in an image that you created, you created an image that depicted a fact about waste. So would you show us an image of that and tell us the story behind it?
Yeah. Okay, so
Yeah, speaking of Japan.
This was a series that I did over quite a few years that was about depicting statistics about our mass consumption. And the underlying kind of concern in that project was that there are all of these invisible phenomena that characterize our world that are incredibly important to understand and comprehend, but there's no way to see them. And of course, the amount of carbon we're putting into our atmosphere is the biggest of all of those. But there are many others, like the number of trees that are being cut down every day to make the cardboard boxes for Amazon.com, or the number of laptop computers that we're discarding every day, or the number of dogs and cats that are being euthanized every day. And there's nowhere that you can go see these phenomena, especially in the collective. And so we read a statistic like there are 2.4 million Americans in prison. And there's no way to see it. You can't go stand in front of that many, you can't go see them. There's no way to experience that phenomenon with our senses. And the number, the statistic that's associated, the number that's associated with that statistic is incomprehensible to our mind.
Could you show us one that looks like an image of one thing, and then you zero in on it and you see it's something else?
Yeah, so this one is about ocean plastic. So this is all plastic that was collected from the Pacific Ocean, and we're slowly zooming back from it. You
Yeah.
can see plastic bottle caps and pens and combs and a flip-flop sandal. And we slowly zoom all the way back. And this is Hokusai's famous, the Japanese artist Hokusai's famous image called The Great Wave off Kanagawa, made from 2.4 million pieces of ocean plastic, which represents a statistic about the quantity of plastic that is entering the world's oceans.
Yeah. So how did you create that? How did you create that image?
I made that entire piece in Photoshop, manually, piece by piece, from thousands of photographs that I took of that plastic. I had about a shopping bag sized full of ocean plastic, and I separated it out and took sort of chunk by chunk, took photographs of it, and then stitched all of that together in Photoshop.
Wow, it's amazing. So, well, I want to ask you one question, then turn it over to Harriet, and then maybe ask you another one. And I apologize, I have to leave at 5 minutes till the hour to do another program, which I am the guest at. So, or a guest. You said in an interview with Lens Culture that the arts can contribute to the healing and transformation of the world. And of course, that is a big part of the philosophy of Radical Joy for Hard Times. You go to a hurt place, you share your stories, you find beauty, and you make beauty. You make art. So I wondered if for you, what you might tell somebody who would say, as we often hear, well, I'm not an artist, I'm not a creative person. When you make a statement like, in art is this healing and a restoration, do you mean only that people can look at it or listen to it and appreciate it, or can they do it themselves? And if so, how?
Beautiful question. Well, I think I would, let's see, what's the best way to answer that? It feels to me like the work that I'm doing is not art. Like all I'm doing is just seeing the world. And that to me is it's part of what I love so much about photography is, and this is my favorite thing to tell art students, is I don't believe there's any talent or any creativity or any artisticness needed to be a photographer. Because as a photographer, the art is already out there. Like there's this unbelievable miracle happening right out my window of these cormorants on this pier, and I don't have to create anything. All I have to do is be present enough to see it and to have the courage to allow my heart to break with love for the beauty of that thing, and then just like a scientist, just take a photograph of it. And I think there's this sense out there that some people think like, I'm not an artist, I'm not creative enough, like that people are afraid they don't have the 1-800 line to whatever is that thing that artists have. And to me, like many of the most successful artists that I know have the same philosophy of me, that I have of my own work. It's we're just allowing something that is available to everybody. There's no special ingredient involved. And at the same time, being connected with the arts, like there's a way that art is a container in our culture for things that it can only contain that are incredibly important. Art helps us live in paradox. It helps us feel things. It reminds us to feel something, and it helps us have perspective. Like art can zoom us back or zoom us in or show us the other side in a way that can expand our consciousness. And it can help us bear complexity when our mind wants so much to go to binary, there's good guys and bad guys, there's evil and good. Like art can expand that tonal scale and remind us of our interconnectedness with everything. And so, and those are things we can all play a role in. And to me, I think one of the most powerful things I've ever heard my teacher, Joanna Macy, say is, as an artist, or she says, as an artist or an activist, the most powerful thing you can ever do in the world is to heal your own heart. And I believe if we could collectively put more attention on that, like make that our central practice, then all of those things out there in the world, all of those problems would take care of themselves.
Well, Chris, Jordan, it's been such an amazing gift it's such an amazing gift to talk with you today. So we're so glad to meet you in person and to introduce you to our listeners and watchers. And thank you for your work, and thank you for the beautiful sensibility that you bring to it and that emerges out of it.
Oh, well, thank you both, Harriet and Trebby, and hello to everybody out there who's been watching. I appreciate so much your deep engagement. I know this is it's not easy material. It takes courage to wade into these waters, and at the same time, it's so incredibly important. So
that's what
thank
we're
you
all about.
And wishing you a wonderful day.
Thank you. Harriet, would you like to take us out with your closing?
Yeah, sure. I've got a little one here. So he's busy actually doing art. He's an artist.
Good.
So and he loves beaches and oceans as well. So but I just wish to thank you again, Chris and Trebby, for holding such a beautiful conversation that is rich with teachings and deeply inspiring. And so as we come to the end of our conversation in the cafe and our tea has been drunk and it's time for us to get ready to go, we first of all thank everybody in the circle, all of those people around us, our colleagues, those with us, the space itself and the conversation that has been so inspiring. And we thank the bear in the north for giving us their wisdom. And we thank the salmon of wisdom in the west over the ocean, giving us their depth and creativity of the ancestors. And we thank the stag of the south and the fire of creativity. And we thank finally the air in the hawk's wings for giving us the clarity of vision and the inspiration of the dawn. And so now we draw our circle to a close. And thank you again. It's been very special.
Thank you.